Jim Crow laws. They were first established in the late 1800s, but came back around the 1950s, went all the way through the 1960s, and still kind of showed up in the 1970s, even though these laws were no longer legal. These laws had a separate but equal status for the blacks, because whites felt superior to the blacks. They felt equal, but they felt they should still be separate. And these blacks were former slaves because after the Civil War, blacks were free, but they weren't saw as equal. They had very limited rights. They did not have the same exact rights as the whites. And this mainly occurred in the South, but it also occurred in the North. Jim Crow was a character from African culture. He was a foolish character to try to get out of his slave work. And by doing that, he did get out of his slave work, which was saw as such a stupid idea, but it obviously was very clever because he got out of it. And this created a stereotype for the blacks because he acted so foolish, so now everyone thought blacks are all foolish. And Thomas Rice is credited for this character because he went up on stage, because he is a comedian, he covered his face in charcoal, and he got up there and sang the song Jump Jim Crow as he did this dance that the blacks would do since they were no longer allowed to do the dances from their native culture. Segregation was a very big part because since they viewed it as separate but equal, blacks were not allowed to go into the same restrooms as the whites or use the same water fountains, and even restaurants and theaters were segregated, and blacks and whites were not allowed to be in the same theater. Also, even transportation. Blacks had to go on Jim Crow cars, but if it was on a bus, they had to stay in the back. And even jobs, segregated. If a white company had an interview with a black employer, they would not get hired just because they were black. And the blood donations were even segregated. Whenever a black man gave blood, it was segregated from the white blood because they did not want to confuse it. If a white man got black blood from a black man, it would cause so much conflict. Plessy versus Ferguson is a huge case in Jim Crow laws because Homer Plessy broke the law by not going in the Jim Crow car. And he felt that he should be allowed to go into the car or bus for the whites, but he would not do it because he believed he should be allowed to. But the ruling was constitutional. This was allowed to happen. It did not affect the 13th or 14th Amendment, so it was viewed as constitutional. So therefore, this is still where separate but equal plays a part. Brown versus Board of Education. Oliver Brown was a black father. He tried to enroll his son into a white public school, but he was denied because of the color of his skin. And he felt that this was wrong, so he appealed to the Supreme Court. And they decided that this was very unconstitutional, so there was no longer segregation in public schools. Black and whites went to the same schools. This didn't end segregation, but at least in public schools it ended. But in 1964, the Civil Rights Act was passed, and this allowed blacks to go into the same restrooms as whites. They were no longer separate. They were all equal. Many white people were not happy with this, but it was the new law and they had to abide by it. The impact. African Americans were affected terribly. They were treated wrongly. They even got into huge fights with whites because whites did not want them in certain places, and it created violence. And they felt powerless, but there were a few role models like Martin Luther King or Rosa Parks. They stood up for their rights. They inspired many blacks to stick up for their rights and show that they are equal. It doesn't matter what their skin color is. So these role models were not really role models to the whites, but to the blacks they were very inspirational because they knew just how they felt, because they were all in the same situation where they were being segregated. So after all of this, they were finally equal, but there's still people out there that don't like this and they want to be segregated, but obviously that cannot happen.